The winter of 1944 gave way to the spring of 1945, and with the changing of the seasons came an undeniable truth that hung in the smoke-choked air over Europe. The end was near. For 6 long years, the continent had been consumed by a maelstrom of fire and steel, a conflict of unprecedented scale and brutality. Now, the great engine of destruction that was Nazi Germany was sputtering, its fuel spent, its gears grinding to a halt. From the east and the west, the armies of the Allied powers were closing in, an iron ring tightening around the black heart of the Third Reich. The final act of this world-spanning tragedy was about to begin, and its stage was to be the rubble-strewn streets of Berlin. The war had been a story of titanic shifts in momentum. After years of Nazi triumphs, the tide had turned irrevocably. On the blood-soaked steppes of Russia, at Stalingrad and Kursk, the Soviet Red Army had broken the back of the Wehrmacht. In the sun-drenched fields of France, following the monumental D-Day landings, the Western Allies, led by the United States and Great Britain, had ripped open a second front. Now the great engine of destruction that was Nazi Germany was sputtering, its fuel spent, its gears grinding to a halt. From the east and the west, the armies of the Allied powers were closing in, an iron ring tightening around the black heart of the Third Reich. The final act of this world-spanning tragedy was about to begin, and its stage was to be the rubble-strewn streets of Berlin. In 1943, with the future still uncertain but hope rekindled, U.S. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had declared with conviction that America must be the one to capture the German capital. His British counterpart, Prime Minister Winston Churchill, a man who understood the immense symbolic and political power of such an act, wholeheartedly agreed. To seize Berlin would be to decapitate the Nazi regime, to stand triumphant in the very lair of the beast. Yet as the spring of 1945 dawned, a strange and fateful paralysis seemed to grip the Western powers. As their armies sliced through Western Germany, encountering crumbling resistance, they made no concerted effort to drive toward the capital. The path, while not without danger, was open. The decision that followed, to halt, to cede the prize, would become one of the most debated and perplexing strategic choices in modern history. The honor, the sacrifice, and the apocalyptic glory of taking Berlin would not fall to them. Instead, it was the Red Army, an institution forged in unimaginable suffering and fueled by a burning desire for vengeance, that would deliver the death blow. The saga of the Battle of Berlin is more than just the story of a city's fall. It is the story of the final, convulsive moments of the Second World War in Europe. It is the tale of the Red Army's monumental achievement, a feat of arms that forced the unconditional surrender of Germany and drove its Führer, Adolf Hitler, to a coward suicide in a subterranean bunker. This victory was the definitive full stop on the European chapter of the war, paving the way for a new, albeit fraught, era of peace and reconstruction. But it was also the first deafening shot in a new kind of conflict, the Cold War, a struggle for the soul of Europe and the world that would be born in the ashes of the Third Reich. This is the story of how that final battle came to be. The Germany that faced the world in early 1945 was but a grotesque caricature of the triumphant nation that had stormed across Europe only a few years earlier. The specter of total defeat, once a distant and unthinkable nightmare, was now a daily, suffocating reality. The Third Reich, intended to last 1,000 years, was entering its death throes. The collapse of an empire. The rot had set in long before the first Allied soldier crossed the Rhine or the first Soviet tank rumbled through the suburbs of Berlin. It began with a fatal miscalculation, an act of hubris on a scale the world had never seen. Operation Barbarossa. Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 was a gamble for total continental domination, but it was a gamble he lost to the infinite vastness of the Russian plains and the unyielding brutality of its winter. The Russian winter of 1941 didn't just freeze the German war machine, it froze the myth of its invincibility. If Barbarossa was the initial wound, the Battle of Kursk in the summer of 1943 was the moment the Reich's spine was irrevocably broken. In the largest tank battle in human history, Hitler threw his elite panzer divisions against the deeply entrenched Soviet forces in a desperate attempt to regain the initiative. The result was a catastrophic defeat. The Red Army, once dismissed as a primitive horde, proved to be a learning, adapting, and utterly ruthless force. After Kursk, the Wehrmacht would never again mount a major strategic offensive on the Eastern Front. From that moment on, its story was one of relentless, grinding retreat. The momentum of the Red Army became a terrifying, unstoppable force of nature, a red tide of men and steel rolling inexorably westward. By 1945, this military decline had metastasized into a full system collapse. The German economy, the industrial heart that had powered the Blitzkrieg, was in ruins. Relentless Allied bombing campaigns, the American daylight precision strikes and the British nighttime area bombing had systematically dismantled the nation's infrastructure. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, and Cologne were little more than moonscapes of rubble and ash. Factories, refineries, and railway hubs were obliterated. The war economy, which Albert Speer had so brilliantly organized to prolong the conflict, was now starved of every essential component. The most critical shortage was fuel. The loss of the Romanian oil fields at Ploiești to the advancing Red Army in 1944 was a mortal blow. Without oil, the panzers that had once terrified the world became little more than static pillboxes. The Luftwaffe's advanced jet fighters, technological marvels that could have contested the skies, were left grounded, their pilots watching helplessly as swarms of Allied bombers flew overhead. The human cost was just as devastating. Years of total war had bled the nation white. The once proud German army was now a shadow of its former self, its ranks filled with the desperate and the unwilling. The Volkssturm, or People's Storm, was a pathetic testament to this reality. Old men, some veterans of the First World War, and young boys, barely in their teens, were handed a rifle or a single-shot anti-tank weapon and thrown into the path of battle-hardened Soviet and American veterans. Their training was minimal, their morale was shattered, and their fate was almost certain death. A deep, pervasive war weariness had settled over the population. The promise of Lebensraum and glory had dissolved into a daily struggle for a crust of bread and shelter from the falling bombs. The Führer's madness and the purge. At the center of this collapsing world, entombed in the concrete labyrinth of the Führer bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, Adolf Hitler descended further into delusion and paranoia. The charismatic leader who had mesmerized a nation was gone, replaced by a stooped, trembling figure, his health ravaged by a cocktail of dubious medications administered by his personal physician, and his mind consumed by rage and betrayal. He spent his days hunched over maps, commanding armies that existed only in his imagination, ordering counteroffensives by divisions that had been wiped out weeks before. His generals would listen in stunned silence as he railed against the cowardice and treachery that he believed was the sole cause of Germany's misfortunes. His strategic directives, once brutally effective, now resembled the fever dreams of a madman. This paranoia was not entirely unfounded. As the certainty of defeat became clear to more rational minds within the military, a desperate plot had been hatched. On July 20, 1944, Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg attempted to assassinate Hitler with a briefcase bomb. The Führer's miraculous survival, shielded by a heavy oak table, unleashed a wave of terror that dwarfed all previous purges. Hitler saw betrayal everywhere. The Gestapo and the SS worked with ruthless efficiency, rounding up thousands of suspects. A wave of show trials and brutal executions followed. The purge eviscerated the traditional Prussian officer corps, replacing seasoned strategists with fanatical Nazi loyalists. Among the most famous victims was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox. Implicated in the plot, he was given a choice: either face a public trial and bring shame upon his family, or commit suicide and be buried with full military honors. He chose the latter. The death of Germany's most celebrated commander sent a chilling message: no one was safe from the Führer's wrath. This brutal cleansing created a vacuum of competence and sowed seeds of deep distrust at the very top of the military hierarchy. The internal coherence of the German war effort, already fragile, shattered completely. The once mighty Wehrmacht was now a headless beast flailing in its death throes, led by a madman from a concrete tomb.
As the German Reich disintegrated, a new and far more complex strategic game was being played by the victorious powers. The common goal of defeating Nazism had papered over deep ideological divides. But with the enemy on the ropes, those divisions were re-emerging with stark clarity. The final moves on the European chessboard were not just about military victory. They were about shaping the post-war world. The German High Command, or what was left of it, understood this new dynamic with chilling precision. They knew surrender was inevitable, but they believed they still had one card left to play. They could choose who they surrendered to. A deep, primal fear of the Red Army pervaded the German military and civilian population. They had heard the stories, and they knew they were true, of the scorched earth policies and unimaginable atrocities their own armies had committed in the Soviet Union. They expected a terrible retribution, a vengeance enacted not just on their soldiers, but on their families, their cities, their very civilization. The cry of the Soviet soldier, "On to Berlin," was not just a military objective, it was a promise of a brutal reckoning. In contrast, they viewed the Western Allies, the British and Americans, as a more civilized enemy. They anticipated prisoner of war camps, not summary executions. Occupation, not enslavement. This led to a bizarre, unspoken strategy in the final months of the war. On the Eastern Front, German soldiers were ordered to fight to the last man, to form fortress cities and bleed the Red Army for every inch of ground. The goal was simple: to slow the Soviet advance, to buy time. Simultaneously, on the Western Front, resistance began to melt away. Entire divisions surrendered with barely a fight. In some sectors, German commanders effectively opened the gates, practically inviting the Anglo-American forces to advance as quickly and as deeply into Germany as possible. Their desperate hope was that the Americans and British would reach Berlin first, saving them from the wrath of the Soviets. Even after the official surrender, remnants of German armies on the Eastern Front would continue to fight ferociously, not for victory, but for a chance to break through the Soviet lines and surrender to the West. While the Germans played their desperate game, the Red Army was preparing a blow of stunning force. In a series of brilliant victories, they had pushed to the borders of the Reich. The culmination of this advance was the Vistula-Oder offensive, launched in January 1945. In one of the most successful and swift operations of the entire war, the Soviet forces under Marshals Georgy Zhukov and Ivan Konev shattered the German lines in Poland. The scale was immense. The Soviets unleashed nearly 2.5 million soldiers, supported by a staggering concentration of artillery, tanks, and aircraft. The German defenses, stretched thin and poorly supplied, simply vaporized. In less than a month, the Red Army advanced over 300 miles from the Vistula River in central Poland to the Oder River, a mere 40 miles from Berlin itself. In the process, they had destroyed 35 German divisions and captured over 140,000 prisoners. The road to Berlin was now open. Zhukov's first Belarusian front had established bridgeheads on the west bank of the Oder, creating the perfect springboard for the final assault. The heart of the Reich was within artillery range. With Soviet forces poised at the gates of Berlin, the world watched and waited for the Western Allies to make their move. The stage was set for a dramatic race to the capital, a final competition between the great powers to claim the ultimate prize. But the race never happened. The decision to halt the Western advance was a conscious one, born not of military necessity, but of cold, hard geopolitical calculation. Eisenhower's pragmatism versus Churchill's foresight. Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower was, above all, a military pragmatist. He viewed the war through the lens of objectives and casualties. In his assessment, Berlin was no longer a military objective of strategic importance. The German army was effectively broken, and the true goal was to prevent its remnants from regrouping for a final, suicidal stand. He was far more concerned about a rumored Nazi plan to retreat to a national redoubt in the Alps of southern Germany, a fortress from which they could wage a protracted guerrilla war. While this fear later proved to be based on faulty intelligence, it shaped his strategic priorities. Furthermore, Eisenhower calculated that a direct assault on Berlin would be incredibly costly. The city was heavily defended, and he estimated that a push to the capital could cost the Western Allies as many as 100,000 casualties. Why, he reasoned, should he sacrifice American and British lives for a prestige objective that, according to the agreements made by the Allied leaders at the Yalta Conference months earlier, was destined to fall within the Soviet zone of occupation anyway? The political decision had already been made. For Eisenhower, the military cost was simply not worth the symbolic gain. His duty was to his soldiers, and he would not spend their lives needlessly. Winston Churchill saw the situation through a different, more political, and far more prescient lens. He was deeply mistrustful of Joseph Stalin and the Soviet Union's post-war ambitions. He watched with growing alarm as the Red Army consumed Eastern Europe, installing communist puppet governments in its wake. Churchill argued vehemently that the Western Allies should push as far east as possible, capturing not only Berlin but also Prague and Vienna. He believed that the physical presence of Western troops would be the only effective bargaining chip in the coming confrontation with Stalin over the future of Europe. He foresaw the Iron Curtain that would soon descend across the continent, and he desperately wanted the West to hold a stronger position before it fell. But Churchill's was a voice crying in the wilderness. President Roosevelt, whose health was failing rapidly, placed his faith in his ability to manage Stalin and in the future of the United Nations. He sided with his generals, deferring to Eisenhower's military judgment. The American military establishment had little appetite for a political dash that could lead to a direct confrontation with their still official Soviet allies. And so the order was given. The Western armies would halt their eastward advance at the Elbe River, leaving Berlin to its fate. Stalin's imperative, the prize of prizes. For Joseph Stalin, the capture of Berlin was an absolute, non-negotiable imperative. It was a goal layered with meaning, military, political, and deeply personal. Militarily, it was the final destruction of the fascist beast that had invaded his homeland and killed over 27 million of his people. Politically, it was the ultimate symbol of Soviet power and the triumph of communism over fascism. The red flag flying over the Reichstag would be an indelible image, a declaration to the world that the Soviet Union was a global superpower, the primary victor in the war against Hitler, and the new dominant force in Europe. But for Stalin and for the entire Soviet people, it was also about vengeance. The memory of Nazi atrocities, the siege of Leningrad, the massacres at Babi Yar, the destruction of countless villages, was a raw, open wound. The capture of Berlin was to be the final act of a national crusade for retribution. Understanding the immense symbolic weight of the prize, Stalin orchestrated the final assault with a characteristic mix of strategic acumen and ruthless cunning. He turned the capture of Berlin into a personal competition between his two most brilliant and ambitious commanders, Marshal Georgy Zhukov, the conqueror of Moscow, and Marshal Ivan Konev, his great rival. By refusing to clearly demarcate the operational boundaries between their two army groups as they approached the city, Stalin deliberately stoked their rivalry, ensuring they would drive their men forward with maximum speed and ferocity, each desperate to claim the honor of being the first into the city. He didn't just want Berlin taken,
He wanted it taken quickly, decisively, and before the Western Allies could possibly change their minds. Thus, by mid-April 1945, the die was cast. In the West, the armies of America, Britain, and France stood down, their gaze shifting from the immediate battle to the long, uncertain peace that lay beyond. In the East, the Red Army coiled its immense power, preparing to spring. 2.5 million Soviet soldiers, thousands of tanks, and a sky-darkening armada of artillery pieces were arrayed along the Oder River, ready to unleash a storm of fire and steel upon the German capital. Inside Berlin, a city of ghosts and ruins, a ragtag collection of defenders braced for the apocalypse. Hardened SS veterans, Hitler youth boys with fear in their eyes, and elderly men of the Volkssturm manned barricades made from the rubble of their own homes. They were the last, desperate line of defense for a doomed regime. The world held its breath. The greatest war in human history was converging on a single point. The battle for Berlin would not be a simple conquest. It would be a Götterdämmerung, a twilight of the gods. A final, ferocious spasm of violence that would consume a city and birth a new world order from its ashes. As we conclude this first part, we have explored the context of Germany's collapse, the strategic calculations of the Allied powers, and the immense forces gathering for the final confrontation. In the next chapter, we will plunge into the heart of the storm itself. We will witness the Red Army's ferocious assault on the Seelow Heights, the brutal street-by-street fighting that turned Berlin into a slaughterhouse, and the final, desperate moments of Adolf Hitler in his bunker as the world he sought to create came crashing down around him. Join us as we recount how the Red Army smashed the final bastion of the Third Reich and what fate awaited Germany after the guns at last fell silent.